In the summer of 1965, the wind carried dust through the broken alleys of Indianapolis. The heat pressed heavy on the pavement, but no one could have guessed the cold cruelty brewing behind the thin walls of a small house on East New York Street. No one could have known that inside, the soul of a 16-year-old girl was being quietly shattered. Her name was Sylvia May. She was the second daughter of Lester and Betty Likens, two transient carnival workers who never seemed to find a permanent rhythm in life. Sylvia had a younger sister, Jenny, who walked with a limp from childhood polio. The girls were close, closer than most siblings, bound by a shared world of constant movement and unsteady homes. Sylvia was bright-eyed, sweet-tempered, and loved small things. Penny candy, swing sets, stories of Elvis. She had dreams, too. Quiet ones, like becoming a schoolteacher or owning a little dog she could name herself. But dreams, like children, sometimes end up in the wrong hands. When Lester and Betty landed a new job traveling with the carnival, they made a decision born of exhaustion and hope. They would leave their daughters in the care of a woman who had been recommended by a friend. Her name was Gertrude Baniszewski, a worn-out mother of 7, barely surviving on welfare checks and resentment. Gertrude had a frail frame and a voice that crackled like burnt paper. Her home, barely furnished, was cluttered with ashtrays, peeling paint, and the weight of too many mouths to feed. Still, she agreed to take in Sylvia and Jenny for a weekly payment of $20. That was the arrangement, a simple exchange of responsibility, a temporary safe harbor. It would be the last place Sylvia would ever live. First, things were quiet. Sylvia helped around the house. She swept the floor, looked after the younger children, and tried her best to stay out of the way. Jenny, shy and slow-moving, leaned on her sister in more ways than one. Sylvia became her translator in that house, her anchor, but the payments from Lester came late. And for Gertrude, who was already bitter at the world, it was enough to turn frustration into fury. What began as cold glances soon grew into cutting words. Gertrude started blaming Sylvia for everything. The missing money, the messes in the house, even the behavior of her own children. She called her names, filthy, whore, trash. And then, one evening, she slapped her across the face. Sylvia didn't tell anyone. Not her sister. Not the neighbors. Not her parents. She stayed silent, because that's what girls were taught to do. The abuse crept in like a draft through a cracked window, barely noticed until it froze everything. Gertrude's children, particularly her daughter Paula, joined in. Paula was 17, angry, and pregnant. She resented Sylvia's smile, her thinness, her presence. She saw her as a punching bag for her own regrets. What made things worse was that Sylvia tried to stay kind. She still helped. She still thanked Gertrude for dinner. She still tried to fit in. But nothing stopped it. Not the slaps. Not the chores. Not the fake smiles. Gertrude began accusing Sylvia of spreading rumors about her daughters. She told the household that Sylvia was impure, that she was sleeping around, that she deserved to be punished. She invited her children to mock her. It became a family ritual, a cruel performance where Sylvia was the villain, and everyone else played judge and executioner. And the worst part? Some neighborhood children began joining in. The house became a stage of cruelty, and no one outside seemed to notice or care. Sylvia, once a joyful girl who loved soda fountains and Sunday dresses, began to shrink. She stopped speaking as much. She flinched at sudden movements. She clung to Jenny whenever she could. But Gertrude noticed the bond between them and began separating them deliberately. Jenny, too weak and terrified to defend her sister, was forced to watch from the sidelines, trapped in a guilt she would carry for the rest of her life. At night, the screams sometimes leaked through the walls. Neighbors would later testify that they heard cries, but they never called the police. Perhaps they assumed it was just another family argument. Perhaps they didn't want to get involved. The screams would stop eventually, and silence always felt safer than curiosity. One day, after a particularly brutal beating, Sylvia tried to escape. She ran to a neighbor's house and asked for food. pretending it was for her siblings. Her lips were cracked. Her ribs were showing. But she smiled anyway. She was sent back. No one asked questions. No one looked closely. No one saw the bruises beneath her sleeves. It's strange how a house can absorb pain, how the air inside thickens, how time bends around suffering. For Sylvia, each hour stretched like rubber bands pulled tight. There were days when Gertrude wouldn't let her eat. Other days when she was forced to stand naked in front of others, humiliated and degraded. And yet, through it all, she held on to something invisible, something we can only guess at. Hope, maybe, or just the simple desire to be seen. The last letter Sylvia ever wrote was addressed to her parents. In shaky handwriting, she begged them to come back. She said she was fine, but the fear bled through the ink. They never received the letter. By then, the damage was already too deep. And the storm hadn't even reached its worst. By late September 1965. The house on East New York Street had become more than just a home. It had become a tomb. Not for the dead, but for the living. For Sylvia May, it was a place where time no longer moved forward, where every day was another chapter in a nightmare that refused to end. The punishments weren't random anymore. They were organized, systematic, ritualistic. Gertrude Baniszewski, a woman who looked like she'd been drained by life, had transformed herself into something darker, something colder. Her cruelty wasn't impulsive anymore. It was calculated, planned, almost theatrical. She would call Sylvia into the living room in front of her children and the neighborhood kids, as if she were directing a play. And Sylvia, gaunt and shaking, would stand there as they surrounded her, laughing, pointing, hurting. Gertrude turned her suffering into entertainment. There was no escape. Sylvia's body began to change. Her cheekbones became sharper. Her stomach shrank. Her eyes lost their glow. Her once thick brown hair became dull and brittle. She was slowly starving. Not just for food, but for safety. For mercy. For a sign that someone out there remembered she was alive. But no one came. Gertrude began keeping Sylvia in the basement, locking her in for hours at a time. She was denied access to the bathroom. She was made to urinate in a corner. When she made a mess, she was forced to clean it up with her own hands, and sometimes her tongue. Then the branding came. It was a hot sewing needle, or maybe a piece of metal from the stove. Witnesses would later disagree. But what they wouldn't disagree on was what it said. I'm a prostitute and proud of it. Carved into the skin of a teenage girl. Not even old enough to drive. Not even old enough to understand why life had turned so cruel. The number 3 was burned into her chest, as if to reduce her identity to something meaningless. As if pain was her only purpose now. And Gertrude didn't do it all alone. Her children helped. So did the neighbor kids. Some were as young as 10. There was a boy named Coy Hubbard, Paula's boyfriend. He was just a teenager himself. But he'd come over after school to practice judo on Sylvia, slamming her to the ground, choking her out, laughing. Another boy named Richard Hobbs held her down during the branding. They weren't strangers. These were the children Sylvia used to say hello to on the street. Now they were her tormentors. Even Paula, pregnant and mood-swinging, used her fists, once breaking her own wrist while punching Sylvia in the jaw. She wore the cast proudly. She called it her trophy. Jenny, Sylvia's younger sister, remained in the house the entire time, but her body was too weak, and her spirit too paralyzed by fear, to stop what was happening. Gertrude warned her, if she told anyone, the same would happen to her. So she stayed silent. Every night, she watched her sister fade, and every morning, she hated herself a little more. In early October, Sylvia tried to write a letter to her parents again. Her hands were trembling. Her ribs were visible through her shirt. But she still found the strength to put pen to paper. The words were jumbled, but the message was clear. Dear Mom and Dad, I miss you. I don't know what to do anymore. Please come back. She never finished it. Gertrude found the letter. She ripped it up, and the beatings got worse. One day, in a moment of distorted kindness, Gertrude allowed Sylvia to come upstairs and lay on a dirty mattress. It was stained and sagging, pushed into the corner of a room where sunlight no longer reached. Sylvia didn't move. She couldn't. Her body had started shutting down. Her lips were bleeding, her eyes swollen shut, her limbs twitching involuntarily from starvation and internal bleeding. She was dying, and still no one called for help. On October 25, 1965, 3 months after she had entered the Baniszewski home, Sylvia whispered something faint to Jenny. "I think I'm going to die." Jenny cried and held her hand. It would be the last time she heard her sister speak. The next morning, Gertrude finally called the police. Not out of guilt, but because she needed a cover story. When officers arrived, she handed them a note. One she'd forced Sylvia to write before she collapsed. The letter claimed she'd been attacked by a group of boys in a van after running away. But the moment the police stepped inside, everything fell apart. They found Sylvia's body on that mattress upstairs. She was barely clothed. Her skin was torn and bruised. The cigarette burns were too many to count. The words branded on her abdomen were unmistakable. Her eyes were open, but she was gone. Jenny, who had been waiting in the hallway, did something she hadn't dared to do in weeks. She walked up to one of the officers, and she whispered, "Get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." The silence in that house didn't last long. Once Sylvia's body was taken away, the walls that had swallowed her screams for months began to speak. Through evidence, witnesses, and the shattered voice of a sister who had lived in fear for far too long, Jenny Likens kept her promise. She told the police everything. Every slap, every insult, every burn. Names poured out of her like floodwaters. Gertrude, Paula, Coy, Richard, Stephanie, John Jr., all of them. She told them about the branding, about the forced baths in scalding water, about the mock confessions Gertrude made Sylvia give aloud in front of the kids, about the food deprivation, about the time Sylvia was forced to insert a glass Coke bottle into herself while they laughed. The officers didn't say a word. They just listened, and then they called for backup. The house was searched. Every corner was examined, and the horrors confirmed what Jenny said. Bloodstains, feces, a basement that looked more like a dungeon. The mattress was the final insult. Soaked, torn, and unfit even for a stray dog. The city of Indianapolis was stunned. But shock turned to rage when details came out in court. The trial of Gertrude Baniszewski and her accomplices began in 1966. The courtroom was packed every single day. Reporters, family, neighbors who had once ignored the screams, all now staring at the woman who'd orchestrated a murder from inside a rundown home. Gertrude sat there in her faded dress, her face blank, almost grandmotherly, deceptively mild. But as prosecutors read aloud Sylvia's injuries, the illusion shattered. They read the autopsy, a subdural hematoma from a blow to the right temple, over 150 cigarette burns, deep muscle bruising, malnutrition, internal bleeding, shock, the branding on her stomach, the number 3 seared into her chest, and injuries to her genital area so horrific, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. People cried. Some walked out. Others clenched their fists. One juror had to excuse herself from the courtroom altogether. Then came the witnesses. Jenny Likens, barely able to speak above a whisper, described how her sister cried every night. How she asked, "Why do they hate me?" How she begged Jenny to tell their parents if she didn't make it. A neighborhood boy testified to watching Coy Hubbard throw Sylvia into a wall, like a rag doll. A doctor described Sylvia's injuries as the worst case of child abuse he had ever seen. Gertrude's defense team painted her as mentally unstable, overburdened, overwhelmed. They blamed Sylvia. They called her a liar, a manipulator, a flirt. But the public wasn't buying it. Not this time. After weeks of testimony, the jury came back. Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. Her daughter Paula was convicted of second-degree murder. Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, and John Jr. were convicted of manslaughter. All were sent to juvenile detention centers. The sentences weren't enough for many. Some people wanted the death penalty. Others wanted to know how so many could have watched and done nothing. Neighbors, schoolmates, social workers, all had failed Sylvia. Gertrude served only 20 years. She was released in 1985, paroled. She changed her name, moved to Iowa, and died of cancer in 1990. Paula also changed her name. She became a school teacher under an alias until she was found out and removed. Many of the others disappeared into normal lives. But Sylvia's name never disappeared. It became louder. In the wake of her murder, Indiana passed new laws. Mandatory reporting laws that required anyone, not just teachers or doctors, to report suspected child abuse. Failure to do so could result in prosecution. Her case was taught in police academies and college criminology courses. It was the blueprint for how a system can fail, and how it must never again. Years later, a memorial was placed in Willard Park in Indianapolis, not far from the house that once held her prisoner. It bears her photo, a simple poem, and symbols of childhood innocence. Stuffed animals, butterflies, handwritten notes. Nearby, a tree is decorated with ribbons and lights. People still leave coins and flowers. Her grave in Oak Hill Cemetery in Lebanon, Indiana, is modest. A small headstone. It reads, "Our darling daughter, Sylvia M. Likens, 1949 to 1965. But it's rarely bare. There's always something there. A bracelet, a teddy bear, a letter from a stranger. People who never met her still come, because somehow we all feel like we did." Sylvia was more than a victim. She was a mirror held up to society, a society that turned away when it should have looked closer. Her story became a warning, a reminder, and a vow to never look away again, to speak up when someone is suffering, to believe the quiet ones, to protect the ones who can't fight back. Her sister, Jenny, never fully recovered from the guilt. She married, had children, and tried to live a life beyond the shadow of what she saw. But Sylvia's memory was always there. In an interview before her death, Jenny said, "I think about her every day. I hear her voice in my dreams. She didn't die alone. I was there. I should have done more. But I was a child too." This story ends where it began, with a girl full of dreams. Not famous, not rich, just kind. That's what everyone said about Sylvia, that she was kind. And that was enough to be hated by people who had forgotten what kindness looked like. If you walk through Willard Park today, you might miss the memorial tucked under the trees. But if you stand still, you might feel something. Not wind, not heat, but a presence. Not haunting, just remembering. And somewhere, if you listen closely, maybe you'll hear her. The voice of Sylvia Likens, still whispering through the leaves. "I deserve to live."